The silence before the truth. The night had fallen quiet over Los Angeles. The city lights shimmered like distant stars, blurred behind the thin curtain of Sandra Bullock's apartment window. She sat alone on the couch, a half-empty cup of tea, cooling beside her, staring at a single photograph resting on the table. It was from the set of the first film she ever did with Keanu Reeves. Their young faces smiled under bright lights, full of energy and innocence, unaware of the stories that time would carve between them. Sandra's fingers traced the edges of the picture, her heart heavier than she wanted to admit. There was something she had kept buried for years, something she had promised herself never to say. But now, that silence was starting to hurt more than the truth itself. Keanu, on the other side of the city, was returning home after another long day of filming. His life had always been wrapped in quiet moments. He had learned to find peace in stillness, in silence, in the company of his own thoughts. But lately, a strange restlessness had followed him. He would find himself thinking of Sandra without reason. How she laughed on set, how she once sat next to him in complete silence yet said everything with her eyes. There was a kindness in her that had stayed with him long after the cameras stopped rolling. Tonight, as he opened the door to his apartment, he saw that same old picture on his kitchen counter, the one they had taken on their last day together on speed. He smiled faintly, unaware that destiny was quietly preparing something he didn't expect. Earlier that day, Sandra had received a message from an old crew member inviting her to a small reunion dinner. Keanu was also invited. She hadn't seen him in years. Her heart skipped a beat reading his name. Time had changed many things, but some feelings never really faded. They just went quiet, waiting. She hesitated at first. What would she say to him? What if he remembered things differently? But the curiosity was stronger than her fear. Maybe, after all these years, she needed to see him. Not as a co-star, but as someone who had unknowingly changed the way she saw kindness and love. The next evening, Sandra arrived early at the restaurant. It was a quiet, dimly lit place with old jazz music humming softly in the background. She chose a seat near the window, nervous fingers playing with the rim of her glass. One by one, familiar faces appeared. Old jokes resurfaced. Laughter filled the air. But every time the door opened, her eyes lifted. She was waiting for him. And then, like a calm wave entering a noisy shore, Keanu walked in. Simple black shirt, relaxed smile, eyes that carried the same gentle warmth she remembered. When their eyes met, the noise around her faded. It felt like time had folded back on itself. They hugged, awkward at first, then naturally, like two souls recognizing something they once shared. Keanu pulled the chair beside her. "You look the same," he said softly. She smiled. "You still lie the same way." He laughed, that quiet laugh that always made people around him feel safe. The night went on with stories and laughter, but beneath the surface, Sandra's heart was racing. She could feel the words pressing against her chest, the truth she had held back all these years. Every time she looked at him, she remembered that one day on set when she almost told him everything, but didn't. When the dinner ended and everyone started leaving, Sandra and Keanu stayed behind, watching the city through the window. He turned to her and said, "You've been quiet tonight." She looked at him for a moment, then away. "I've been thinking," she said slowly, "about the past. About how sometimes we hide the most important things because we're afraid of how others will see us." Keanu nodded, his eyes gentle. "Or maybe we hide them because they mean too much," he said. His words felt heavier than she expected. There was a pause, a silence that seemed to pull everything else away. Sandra took a deep breath. "Keanu," she whispered, "there's something I should have told you years ago." He looked at her, confused but calm. The room around them seemed to shrink, the sound of music fading into a distant hum. She wanted to say it right, to speak without breaking. Her hands trembled slightly as she tried to find courage in his gaze. When we were filming, do you remember that scene where we had to hold hands before the bus jumped? He smiled faintly. Of course. I remember your hands were shaking. She nodded, her voice soft. They weren't shaking because of the scene. They were shaking because I realized something then. I realized that. Her voice stopped. She couldn't finish. The weight of years pressed against her throat. Keanu leaned closer, his voice barely above a whisper. That what? His eyes searched hers, not demanding, just patiently waiting. Sandra looked down, afraid that if she said it, things would change forever. That I had fallen for you, she finally whispered, almost too softly for the words to exist. Keanu froze. For a moment, he didn't breathe. The room was still. Her confession hung between them like fragile glass, beautiful and terrifying. Sandra's eyes filled with quiet tears. I never said it because you were going through so much back then. I didn't want to make it harder. I thought maybe silence was kindness. But it stayed with me all these years. She looked away, ashamed of her own honesty. Keanu didn't move, his face unreadable. The silence stretched long enough for her heart to break. And then, gently, he said, Sandra, you should know something too. She looked up, her breath caught. That day, when you were shaking, I thought it was fear. But I was the one who was afraid, because I felt it too. Her eyes widened, tears slipping silently. Neither spoke again for several seconds. The world outside the window blurred into colors. Keanu reached out and took her hand the same way he once did years ago on that movie set. I guess we both kept the same secret, he said softly. She nodded, speechless, her fingers trembling in his. But before the moment could settle, a sudden voice called Keanu's name from across the room. It was a woman's voice, familiar, sharp. Sandra turned to see a tall woman approaching them quickly, her expression serious. Keanu's face shifted. The warmth in his eyes dimmed slightly. This is Elena, he said quietly. We've been working together for a while. Sandra smiled politely, but something in her chest tightened. The air grew heavier again. Elena placed a hand on Keanu's arm and said, We need to go. They're waiting for you. Sandra understood immediately. Whatever moment they just shared was slipping away. Keanu looked back at Sandra, his eyes apologetic. Can we talk later? He asked. She nodded faintly, forcing a smile. Of course. But as he left with Elena, her heart sank. Outside the window, the city lights blurred once more. She whispered to herself, Some truths come too late. What she didn't know was that the truth she had just spoken would soon bring consequences she never expected. And that night, as Keanu drove away, he couldn't stop hearing her words echoing in his mind. Something inside him shifted, something he had buried long ago. He didn't notice the black car that had been following him slowly from a distance. Headlights dimmed. The night was not over. The past had just begun to move again. Shadows of the past. The night grew heavier as Keanu drove down the silent streets of Los Angeles. The faint sound of tires on asphalt echoed in the empty air, and his mind refused to stay quiet. Every few minutes, Sandra's words replayed in his head like a melody that would not fade. I had fallen for you. The way she said it, soft, trembling, full of truth, had cut through the calm he had built over the years. He had always thought he was past such feelings. He had seen loss, he had faced loneliness, and he had made peace with silence. But tonight, something fragile and real had returned, and it terrified him. Behind him, the black car followed at a steady distance, its headlights dimmed, its driver hidden. Keanu was too lost in thought to notice. He turned into the road leading to his home, surrounded by tall trees that swayed gently under the wind. When he parked and stepped out, the air felt strange, too still. He looked around for a moment, then shook it off and went inside. The apartment was quiet, dimly lit by a single lamp. He placed his jacket on the couch and sat down, trying to breathe slowly. But the silence was louder than ever. Sandra sat at her window that same night, unable to sleep. She had done something she never thought she would do. She had told him the truth. And now every part of her wondered if it was too late. She remembered the look on his face, the pause in his breath, the softness in his eyes before that woman arrived. Elena. The name stayed in her mind like an echo she couldn't erase. Maybe Keanu had moved on. Maybe she had just opened an old wound for no reason. But somewhere deep inside, a quiet voice told her that what she saw in his eyes wasn't indifference. It was unfinished emotion. A sudden knock on her door startled her. It was almost midnight. Sandra froze for a second, her heart racing. She hesitated before opening it slightly. It was her assistant Claire holding a small envelope. "This came for you just now," Claire said, confused. "Someone left it downstairs." Sandra frowned, taking the envelope. It was unmarked, no name, no address. Just her initials written in neat handwriting. She opened it slowly. Inside was a single photograph. It was of her and Keanu from the reunion dinner earlier that night, taken secretly through the restaurant window. There was no note, no explanation, just the image. A chill ran down her spine. She looked outside, scanning the quiet street. There was no one there. She closed the door quickly and locked it, her hands trembling slightly. "Who would take this?" she whispered to herself. She sat down, staring at the photo again. Something about it felt wrong. Not just the invasion of privacy, but the fact that someone had gone to the trouble of printing it and delivering it to her personally. Her first thought went to Keanu. Did he get something like this too? Should she tell him? But she hesitated. Maybe it was nothing. Maybe it was just a fan who had been nearby. Still, she placed the photo face down on the table, unable to shake off the unease. The next morning, Keanu woke up early. The sun filtered weakly through the curtains, painting soft lines across the floor. He had barely slept. His phone buzzed. It was a message from Elena. "We need to talk. Something strange happened last night." He frowned, unsure what she meant. A few minutes later, another message appeared from an unknown number. It was the same photograph Sandra had received. Underneath it was a short message. "Some stories are better left untold." Keanu stared at the screen for several seconds, his heart pounding. He looked around his apartment instinctively, then at the window facing the street. The sense of being watched crawled over him. He immediately called Elena. She answered after a few rings, her voice tense. "Did you get it too?" she asked before he could say anything. "Yeah," he said quietly. "The same photo?" "Yes," she replied. "Someone sent it to me this morning." No name, no number. I thought maybe it was a prank, but... Her voice trailed off. Keanu took a deep breath. "Don't worry," he said softly. "I'll figure this out." That day, Sandra went to the studio for a small interview. Cameras flashed, people smiled, and everything looked normal from the outside. But inside, her mind was elsewhere. During a break, she stepped outside to breathe, only to find a small note taped to her car windshield. Her hands shook as she pulled it off. It read, "You don't know what you've started." She looked around quickly, scanning faces, but no one seemed out of place. Panic started to creep in. She called Keanu immediately. When he answered, his tone was calm but guarded. "Sandra," he said quietly, "we need to talk in person." They met at a quiet park in the evening, away from the noise of the city. Sandra arrived first, her heart pounding. When Keanu approached, she saw the same unease in his eyes. "You got something too," she said before he could speak. He nodded and showed her his phone. She handed him the note she had found. Both stood in silence for a while, the air between them thick with confusion and fear. "Do you think it's someone we know?" she asked softly. Keanu shook his head. "I don't know, but it's not random. Someone wanted to remind us that truth has consequences." Sandra sighed deeply. "Maybe it's just a sick joke." Keanu's expression didn't change. "Maybe. Or maybe someone doesn't want us to reconnect." She frowned. Why would anyone care? He didn't answer right away. Instead, he looked out toward the sunset, the orange light brushing across his face. People remember things differently, he said. Sometimes the past we think we've left behind still belongs to someone else. Sandra didn't fully understand what he meant, but the tone in his voice made her uneasy as they walked toward the parking lot. A man sitting on a nearby bench lifted his phone and quietly took another photo of them. They didn't notice. Behind that calm evening sky, something darker was beginning to move. That night, Sandra couldn't shake off the tension. She called Claire again to stay over. They sat on the couch watching an old movie, but halfway through, Sandra's phone buzzed. Another message. It was a short video clip, grainy and dark. It showed Keanu's car parked outside her building from the night before. Someone had been watching. Her chest tightened as she realized what this meant. Whoever was behind this had been close. Too close. Meanwhile, Keanu received a call from a blocked number. He hesitated before answering. The voice on the other end was low, calm, unfamiliar. "You should have stayed silent," it said. "Some things are better buried." And then the line went dead. Keanu sat still for a moment, the words echoing in his mind. He looked at the photo again, then at his own reflection in the dark window. The same quiet calm he was known for now felt like a fragile shell cracking from within. He had lived a life built on peace, humility, and distance. But something from the past, something he couldn't name, was reaching for him again. And as midnight passed, Sandra sat by her window once more, watching the city lights flicker. She whispered to herself, "What did I do?" But somewhere in that question was another truth waiting to be uncovered, one that would change not only her and Keanu, but the story they both thought they had left behind. The message in the dark, the morning came with a dull gray sky that seemed to mirror the heaviness both Sandra and Keanu carried inside. Neither had slept. The memories of the previous night, the strange messages, the photographs, the phone call were still vivid, pressing on their minds like an unshakable weight. Keanu sat by his window with a cup of untouched coffee, staring at the city below. He had spent years living a quiet life, avoiding drama, choosing peace over chaos. Yet now peace felt far away. His phone buzzed again and his pulse quickened. It was from an unknown number once more. But this time, it contained only 3 words. "You were warned." He exhaled slowly, then called Sandra. She answered immediately, her voice low and shaky. "I got another one," she said before he could speak. "It was slipped under my door sometime during the night. It said the same thing." Keanu's jaw tightened. "We need to go to the police," he said quietly. "This isn't just some random stalker. Someone's watching us closely." Sandra hesitated. "But if it gets out, the press will turn it into something else. You know how they are. They'll twist it." He paused, understanding. They had both lived through that before. Stories that weren't true. Headlines that cut deeper than any truth could. "Then we'll handle it quietly," he said. "Meet me at the studio at noon. We'll figure it out." By the time Sandra arrived, he was already waiting near the side entrance, wearing a cap and sunglasses to avoid attention. She looked tired, her eyes red from lack of sleep. "You okay?" he asked softly. She nodded weakly. "Just scared." He gave her a reassuring smile. "We'll get through this, together." She looked at him for a moment, and in that quiet space, the world outside didn't matter. They were 2 people holding on to something real. Fear, yes, but also trust. Something in his tone made her feel safer than she had in days. They went inside a small private lounge where no cameras were allowed. Keanu placed his phone on the table, scrolling to show her the messages he had received. She did the same. Both were nearly identical, sent minutes apart. "Someone's coordinated," he said. "And whoever they are, they know our movements." Sandra frowned. "You think it's connected to what I said to you?" He looked at her carefully. "Maybe not directly, but maybe it woke something up. Someone who didn't want that part of our past revisited." Sandra's eyebrows drew together. "What do you mean?" Keanu leaned back, his voice slower now. "Back when we were filming The Lake House, remember the producer who suddenly left halfway through? Mark Sullivan." She nodded. Yeah, he was dealing with some kind of lawsuit, right? Keanu nodded again. It wasn't just that. I later learned he was involved in a shady deal with a private investor tied to one of the companies funding the film. There were things buried, contracts, hidden money trails, people paid to stay silent. I didn't know the full story, but I remember. One night, we caught someone trying to take photos of us talking privately on set. The next day, that person vanished. Sandra felt a cold shiver crawl up her spine. You think it's connected to that? He looked at her with quiet certainty. Someone always remembers unfinished business. For a moment, neither spoke. Outside, thunder rumbled faintly. Sandra wrapped her arms around herself. It's been years, Keanu. Why now? He shook his head. Maybe because we started talking again. Maybe because someone thought we'd remember something we shouldn't. He turned to her with gentle eyes. But this isn't your fault. Whatever this is, we'll face it. Later that evening, Sandra returned home, only to find Claire sitting on the couch looking pale. Sandra, Claire said nervously, you need to see this. She handed her a brown envelope. It had been delivered again. No name, no return address. Sandra opened it, her heart pounding. Inside was a small USB drive and a note that said, "Play it alone." She glanced at Claire, unsure whether to do it. After a moment, she plugged it into her laptop. The video began instantly. Grainy, low quality, black and white. At first, it looked like old security footage. Then she froze. The footage showed the set of the lake house. She saw herself and Keanu sitting by the lake, laughing between takes. Then a man appeared in the frame, someone she vaguely recognized from years ago. He walked toward a van behind the set carrying a briefcase, looking over his shoulder. The timestamp in the corner flickered. Then the video cut to black. Sandra sat in silence, her heart racing. Claire, she whispered, where did this come from? Claire shook her head. It was just at the door. No one saw who left it. Sandra leaned back, her hands trembling. She knew what she had just seen wasn't something anyone should still have. Those tapes were supposed to have been destroyed years ago when production ended. Keanu needs to see this, she said firmly. Meanwhile, Keanu was sitting in his living room when the doorbell rang. When he opened it, there was no one there, only a small box left on the ground. Inside was an old photograph of him standing beside the same man from the video, with the words, "Remember this night," written in ink across the back. He stared at it for a long moment. He did remember. It was the night Mark Sullivan had disappeared. He called Sandra immediately. We need to meet, now. They met again at her apartment, both tense, both aware something much deeper was unfolding. She showed him the video. He showed her the photo. When the footage reached the part showing the man with the briefcase, Keanu's face went pale. That's not just anyone, he said quietly. That's the man who was blackmailing Sullivan back then. Sandra stared at him. You're saying someone might think we're involved? He nodded slowly. And maybe someone wants to make sure the truth never comes out. A heavy silence filled the room. The rain began outside, tapping softly against the window. Sandra looked at Keanu with fear and something else, trust. What do we do now? She asked. He took a deep breath. We find out who's behind this, and we do it before they come closer. He stood up and moved toward the door, but then turned back. Sandra, he said softly, whatever happens, I need you to know. I don't regret what you told me. She looked up, her eyes shining. You mean that? He nodded. I've spent half my life running from emotions. But last night, for the first time in a long time, I felt something real again. Her lips parted as if to answer, but before she could speak, the lights in the apartment flickered, then went out. Both froze. The hum of electricity vanished. Only the sound of rain and distant thunder remained. Keanu instinctively moved closer to her. Stay behind me, he whispered. They waited in the dark, hearts pounding as a faint shadow moved across the glass door leading to the balcony. Sandra's breath caught in her throat. Keanu slowly stepped toward it, his hand gripping the edge of a chair. The silhouette paused, then disappeared. Seconds later, the lights came back on. They rushed to the balcony. There was no one there, but a single wet footprint on the floor leading away toward the railing. And next to it, a small folded note soaked in rain. Keanu picked it up, unfolded it carefully. It said, "You can't hide from the past. Both stood frozen, realizing this was only the beginning. The echoes of truth, the rain didn't stop that night. It poured endlessly, as if the sky itself was trying to wash away something dark and unspoken. Sandra sat on the couch, still shaken, while Keanu paced near the balcony door. The wet footprint had already faded, but its image refused to leave their minds. Both knew this wasn't just a coincidence anymore. Someone had been inside, or close enough to be a threat. Keanu turned to Sandra. "We can't stay here," he said firmly. "They're watching this place." Sandra nodded, her voice trembling. "Where do we go?" He hesitated for a moment. "I have a friend, David. He used to work in private security. We'll go to his cabin up north. It's off-grid, no signals, no easy way to trace us. We'll figure out the rest there." She agreed, and within an hour they were on the road, rain streaking across the windshield like liquid glass. The silence between them was thick, but it wasn't empty. It carried fear, unspoken trust, and something fragile that neither wanted to name yet. After 3 hours of driving through winding mountain roads, they reached a secluded cabin surrounded by tall pines. The world here felt quiet, untouched. Keanu parked the car and helped Sandra carry her bag inside. The air smelled of wood smoke and rain. "No one will find us here," he said softly, lighting a small fire. She sat near it, her eyes reflecting the glow. "You've done this before," she said with a faint smile. "Running from the world," he chuckled quietly. "I don't run. I just hide better than most." For the first time in days, she laughed, a small, honest sound that eased the weight in the room. But beneath that light moment, both knew the danger was still close. They just didn't know how close. As night deepened, Sandra couldn't sleep. She stood by the window, watching the rain fall against the forest. Keanu walked up beside her silently, holding 2 cups of coffee. "You're thinking again," he said softly. "You can tell?" She smiled faintly. "You always could." They stood together for a moment, just watching the rain. Finally, she whispered, "Do you ever regret it? The silence between us? All these years we didn't talk?" Keanu looked at her, his expression calm but full of something deep. "I don't regret silence. I regret why we needed it." She turned toward him slowly. "And now?" He took a deep breath. "Now I wish we hadn't waited so long." The warmth of his words lingered in the air. It was a moment neither wanted to break. But before she could answer, a faint buzz came from his phone. The screen flickered once, then showed a new message. "No number. Just text. You shouldn't have left." Keanu's face hardened. "They found us," he whispered. Outside, the forest was still except for the sound of rain. But then, faintly, they both heard it. A car engine somewhere far below the hill growing louder. Keanu grabbed a flashlight and went to the window. 2 distant headlights glimmered through the trees, moving slowly up the dirt road. Sandra's voice shook. "What do we do?" He turned to her, calm but focused. "We wait. I need to see who they are." The lights came closer, then stopped halfway up the path. A man stepped out, tall, wearing a raincoat, his face hidden. He held something small in his hand, a camera. Keanu narrowed his eyes. "That's him," he said quietly. "The same man from the photo." The man looked toward the cabin, lifted the camera, and took a single flash photo. Then he turned and walked back toward his car. Keanu rushed out the door before Sandra could stop him. "Keanu, don't!" she called out, but he was already running through the rain. By the time he reached the road, the car was gone, just tire tracks and mud. He stood there, soaked, his heartbeat echoing in his ears. When he came back inside, Sandra handed him a towel. "You could have been hurt," she said, voice trembling. "He wanted us to see him," Keanu said quietly. "He's not hiding anymore." The next morning, Keanu's friend David arrived at the cabin. He was in his late 40s, serious, sharp-eyed, with the calm of someone who had seen too much. After hearing the full story, he sat back and said, "This isn't about random threats. Whoever's behind this knows your history and your habits." He paused. "You said there was a missing producer, right? Mark Sullivan?" Keanu nodded. David tapped his fingers on the table. "He didn't just disappear. I looked into him years ago. He was declared dead, but there was never a body. His name turned up later in offshore accounts. Someone has been using his identity for transactions in Los Angeles and Canada. Sandra's eyes widened. You mean he's alive? David nodded. Or someone's pretending to be. Keanu leaned forward. And you think that person is behind all this? David looked at him. Someone's cleaning up old traces. If that tape from the set resurfaced, it could expose people. Maybe they thought one of you had it, or could lead them to it. Sandra shook her head. But we don't have anything. David stood looking out the window. They don't know that. Later that evening, Sandra stepped outside for air. The forest was calm, but she felt uneasy. As she looked around, she noticed something hanging from one of the trees near the driveway, a small silver locket. It was strange, out of place. She walked closer and gently opened it. Inside was a tiny photo of herself and Keanu smiling on set years ago. On the other side of the locket was a small engraving that read, "You were always being watched." She dropped it in shock, her breath catching. Keanu rushed out when he heard her gasp. She pointed to the ground, her voice shaking. It was hanging right there. He picked it up and stared at it silently. "They're toying with us," he said. "Trying to make us afraid." Sandra's voice broke. "It's working." He looked at her, his expression softening. "I won't let them hurt you." She wanted to believe him, and deep down, she did. His voice carried the same quiet certainty that always calmed her, even when everything else was falling apart. As they went back inside, David was on his laptop, running a trace on the messages they had received. "Whoever's sending these knows how to mask their location," he said, frowning. But one of them slipped. A ping came from a studio office downtown. Keanu leaned in. "Whose office?" David looked up slowly. "Yours." The words hit like thunder. Keanu stepped back. "That's impossible. I haven't been there in weeks." David's tone was steady. "Then someone who has access to it is part of this." Sandra's eyes filled with dread. "Elena," she whispered. "She said she worked with you on that new project, right? She knew where you'd be when you'd leave everything." Keanu's face went pale as realization hit him. "No," he said quietly. "She wouldn't." But even as he said it, doubt crept in. That night, as they sat by the fire, the quiet was heavy. Sandra leaned forward, her voice soft. "Keanu, if this gets worse, promise me something." He turned to her. "What?" She looked at him, her eyes full of something tender and brave. "Don't face it alone. You always try to protect everyone else, but you don't have to carry this by yourself." He smiled faintly. "You make it sound like you know me too well." She smiled back. "Maybe I do." For the first time in days, the fear seemed to fade just enough for peace to slip in. He reached over and gently took her hand, and neither pulled away. But outside, the camera hidden in the trees blinked once, recording every moment. And miles away in a dimly lit room, Elena watched the footage on her laptop, her expression unreadable. Beside her, a file labeled Lake House Archives. Confidential was open, and a single line on the screen read, "Phase 2 begins tomorrow." The betrayal morning light broke through the thin curtains of the cabin, painting golden stripes across the wooden floor. For a moment, everything looked peaceful. The fire had gone out, the forest outside hummed quietly with the sound of birds, and Sandra was still asleep on the couch, her head resting gently against the armrest. Keanu stood by the window drinking coffee, his mind already awake and alert. He had learned to read silence, to feel the subtle shift in the air when something was wrong. And today, something was. David came in from outside, his jacket wet from dew. "We have a problem," he said quietly. Keanu turned. "What happened?" David placed a small device on the table, a tiny black object no bigger than a coin. "I found this under the railing outside." "It's a listening bug. They know where we are." Keanu's jaw tightened. "How?" David hesitated. "I think someone close to you has been tracking your movements. Every place you've been in the last few days, restaurant, studio, Sandra's house, they knew before it happened. Someone's feeding them information in real time." Sandra woke up at that moment, her eyes heavy with sleep. When she saw the small device on the table, her expression changed immediately. "What is that?" Keanu looked at her, his voice low but firm. "A bug. Someone's been listening." She sat up quickly, panic in her eyes. But who would do that? David looked at her steadily. Someone who had access to your phones, maybe your schedule, your assistant's messages. Claire, Sandra's assistant, flashed in her mind. She shook her head. No, Claire wouldn't. She's been with me for years. David didn't argue. Then that leaves someone else. His eyes shifted to Keanu. Someone from your end. Keanu froze for a moment. The only person who fit that description was Elena. The thought made him uneasy, not because it was impossible, but because it suddenly made too much sense. She knew his every move, had access to his studio, his emails, even his calendar. And lately, she had been asking questions about Sandra, questions that didn't feel right. He looked out the window, his mind racing. If Elena's involved, he said slowly, then we're dealing with more than a stalker. She might be working for someone with power, maybe the same people who were behind Sullivan's disappearance. Sandra's voice trembled slightly. Why would she do that? What would she gain? Keanu turned to her. Control or money? Maybe both. They decided to leave the cabin immediately. Within an hour, they were on the road again, heading toward the city. David followed in another car, scanning for anyone tailing them. For a while, everything seemed quiet. But as they reached the edge of the city, Sandra noticed a black SUV in the rearview mirror, keeping the same distance for miles. Keanu? She said softly. Someone's following us. He glanced in the mirror and saw it too. His hands tightened on the steering wheel. Hold on. He turned sharply into an empty service road near an abandoned warehouse district. The SUV followed. Keanu stopped the car and got out, the rain beginning to fall again. Stay here, he told Sandra. She grabbed his arm. Please don't go out there alone. He gave her a small, reassuring look. Trust me. The SUV pulled up slowly. The door opened and Elena stepped out dressed in black, her expression cold. Keanu's chest tightened, not from fear, but from disappointment. So it's you, he said quietly. She tilted her head, her eyes calm. It was never supposed to go this far, Keanu. He took a step closer. Then why are you here? What do you want? She sighed softly. To protect you and her. You don't understand what you've stumbled into? Then explain it, he said, his tone sharpening. She looked at him for a long moment, then said, Mark Sullivan isn't dead. He's alive, and he's been hiding under a different name. He's been watching you both since that night. He thinks you have something that belongs to him, a tape, a copy of an old confession he made before disappearing. He believes Sandra still has it, or that you do. Keanu frowned. We don't have anything. Elena nodded. I know, but he doesn't believe that. He wants to make sure neither of you ever speak about the past again. Before Keanu could respond, David's car appeared behind them, stopping abruptly. He stepped out, gun drawn, pointing directly at Elena. Step away, he shouted. Elena didn't flinch. You're making a mistake, she said calmly. If you arrest me, you'll never find him. He's closer than you think. Sandra, unable to stay inside, stepped out of the car, the rain soaking through her coat. Elena, she said softly, why didn't you tell us before? You could have warned us. Elena turned toward her, eyes softening. Because he's watching everything. Every call, every move. If I warned you, you'd both be dead by now. David lowered his weapon slightly, but didn't trust her completely. Then why contact us at all? She hesitated. Because I found something he doesn't know I have. She reached into her coat and pulled out a small hard drive. This has everything, emails, video footage, financial records. Enough to expose him? Keanu looked at her, torn between suspicion and belief. Why give it to us? Her voice softened. Because you're the only one he fears. You both survived when others didn't. And maybe you can end it? Before anyone could respond, a distant explosion echoed through the valley. The cabin they had left behind went up in flames. Sandra gasped, her hand covering her mouth. Keanu's eyes widened in horror. David cursed under his breath. They found it. Elena turned to them, her voice urgent. You don't have much time. Take this drive and disappear. I'll delay them. Come with us, Sandra pleaded. Elena shook her head. They'll trace me. If I vanish now, they'll follow you instead. I'll keep them busy. She handed Keanu the hard drive. Trust no one. The truth you'll find here, it's not what you think. And then, Without another word, she got back into her SUV and drove away into the rain. They stood in stunned silence as the fire from the explosion lit up the distant sky. Keanu looked at the drive in his hand, the weight of it sinking in. Sandra whispered, "What if she's right? What if Sullivan's alive?" Keanu nodded slowly. "Then we'll find him." Back at David's office later that night, they connected the drive to his secure computer. Lines of encrypted files appeared, folders labeled with names and dates from years ago. One folder was marked The Lake House. Final cut. Sandra's pulse quickened. "Play it," she said. The screen flickered, showing old footage from the movie set. Behind-the-scenes shots, laughing faces, harmless memories. But halfway through, the tone shifted. The camera zoomed in on a private conversation between Mark Sullivan and another man in a dark suit. The audio was faint, but one sentence came through clearly. "If they find out, it's over. They can't ever know the truth about the crash." The video cut to static. Sandra stared at the screen, her heart pounding. "The crash?" she whispered. Keanu's face went pale. He remembered now, the night after filming Wrapped, when a crew member's car had gone off the road. They were told it was an accident. But what if it wasn't? David rewound the clip, slowing it down. "There's a reflection in the window," he said. "Look closely." They did. In the glass, a faint silhouette appeared, someone standing nearby holding a camera. Someone they both recognized. It was Sandra. Keanu turned to her slowly, confusion and disbelief in his eyes. "You filmed this?" Her face went blank, her breath caught. "No, I don't remember, but deep inside..." Something in her memory began to stir. A buried night she had tried to forget. And a truth she never knew she was part of, and outside, as thunder rolled across the sky, someone watched the same footage from another screen, smiling quietly in the dark. The truth beneath the silence. The room was cold and silent, lit only by the faint blue glow of the computer screen. Sandra sat frozen, her eyes fixed on the paused image of her younger self reflected in the window of the old film set. Keanu stood beside her, his voice low and steady. "You were there that night," he said quietly. "You filmed that conversation." Her hands trembled as she tried to make sense of it. "I don't remember doing that," she whispered. "I don't even remember being near the van after the shoot." David leaned closer to the screen. "Memory can play tricks when trauma's involved," he said gently. "Maybe you saw something you weren't supposed to and blocked it out." Sandra closed her eyes. Fragments of long-buried moments flashing in her mind, the sound of rain that night. The argument behind the trailers, someone shouting her name. She saw a light from a car, a face half hidden by shadow, and the sudden sound of tires skidding. She opened her eyes, gasping. "The crash," she said softly. "It wasn't an accident. I saw it happen." "He wasn't drunk." "He was pushed off the road." Keanu looked at her, realization dawning. "The crew member who died," he whispered. "He worked for Sullivan." She nodded slowly, her voice shaking. "He was going to expose him. That's why Sullivan disappeared. And I recorded part of it." David began typing rapidly, decrypting the rest of the files on the drive. New folders appeared, emails, bank transactions, and a final video labeled Confession. He clicked it. The screen flickered, and the face of Mark Sullivan appeared. Older, tired, eyes filled with regret. "If anyone sees this," Sullivan's recorded voice said, "then I've already failed to bury what happened. The project was funded with illegal money. When Carter threatened to go to the press, I panicked. I didn't kill him myself, but I ordered someone to stop him. It went wrong. He died. I disappeared because I couldn't live with it. But if you're watching this, I'm sorry." The video ended. Silence filled the room. Sandra covered her mouth, tears spilling down her cheeks. Keanu placed a hand on her shoulder gently. "You didn't do anything wrong," he said softly. "You just carried a truth that wasn't yours to carry." David exhaled slowly. "This footage could expose everything. But if you release it, they'll come for you again. Sullivan still has people working for him." Keanu's eyes hardened. "Then we finish this." That night, they drove to a secure safe house owned by one of David's contacts. It was hidden in the desert, far from the city lights. They made a copy of the video and uploaded it to a secure network, scheduling it to release publicly if anything happened to them. For the first time in weeks, Sandra felt like she could breathe again. She stood outside, looking at the endless stretch of desert stars. Keanu joined her quietly. For a while, neither spoke. The night was calm, vast, almost forgiving. "Do you ever think," she whispered, "how strange it is that the truth can hide for years and still find its way out?" Keanu looked at her, the faint wind brushing through his hair. "Truth never dies," he said softly. "It just waits for the right heart to face it." She smiled faintly, her eyes glistening. "You've always been that heart, Keanu. Steady, patient, too kind for the world." He shook his head slightly. "No, maybe I was just waiting for someone brave enough to remind me why kindness matters." She turned to face him, tears in her eyes but peace in her expression. "That night when I told you how I felt," she whispered, "I wasn't expecting anything. I just needed you to know. But after everything we've been through, I realized something." Keanu's gaze held hers. "What?" he asked gently. She stepped closer, her voice trembling but certain. "That sometimes love isn't about timing or even being together. It's about having someone who helps you face yourself. You've always done that for me." For a moment, the world around them fell away. The stars, the wind, the long ache of years between them. Keanu smiled softly, his eyes warm and full of quiet emotion. "You've done the same for me, Sandra. You reminded me that silence isn't peace. It's just waiting for the right voice." Their hands found each other naturally, fingers interlacing as if they had always belonged that way. It wasn't a dramatic moment. It was simple, calm, and deeply human. Two people who had walked through chaos only to find truth waiting at the end of it. Inside, David interrupted the silence. "You both need to see this," he called out. They went in. On the screen, a news report was already playing. The confession video had leaked early. Someone else had accessed the files. Mark Sullivan's face filled the screen, his crimes now public. Law enforcement was reopening the case. Sandra exhaled in relief, though part of her heart still trembled. "It's over," she whispered. David nodded. "For now. But you both need to disappear for a while, just until things settle," they agreed. A few days later, Keanu and Sandra found themselves far from Los Angeles, in a quiet coastal town where the sea met the cliffs. They walked along the beach in silence, their footsteps soft in the sand. For the first time in weeks, there were no cameras, no shadows, no whispers, just the sound of the waves. As they sat on a large rock facing the horizon, Sandra looked at him. "You never asked what I whispered that night," she said quietly. Keanu smiled faintly. "I thought I knew." She shook her head. "No, you don't." He turned to her, curious. "Then tell me." She took a deep breath, the wind brushing through her hair. "I didn't just say I had fallen for you. I whispered something else, but I said it too softly for you to hear." He waited, eyes steady on hers. She smiled gently, eyes filled with emotion. "I whispered, don't forget who you are. Because even back then, I could see you were carrying pain you never talked about. I wanted you to remember that kindness isn't weakness. It's your strength." Keanu's eyes softened, his voice barely above a whisper. "And all this time, I thought you were saying goodbye." She shook her head slowly. "No, I was asking you to stay true to yourself. And you did." The sun dipped lower, turning the sky into a canvas of gold and fire. Keanu reached over, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "Thank you," he said softly, "for reminding me." And as the waves crashed against the rocks and the last light of day wrapped around them, both sat in quiet understanding. No need for more words, no need for promises. The truth had found them, and peace at last had followed. The world would keep talking as it always did, but they had learned something no camera could capture, that even in silence, some connections never fade.